Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. This week, we're going to tackle a number of topics. We decided not to do just one topic this week, but we're going to do a handful of just little pieces and things that have come up over the last month that we want to share with the listeners and hopefully give you guys and gals some things to think about as you get ready to fly or maybe go flying to make you a safer, better pilot. So Wally literally just got out of a check ride in the last hour with a student who had a successful instrument ride, but had some feedback and had some thoughts that he thought he would share. And I think it all begins with the fact that we are sharing these friendly skies. Is that the case, Wally?
Yeah, and what I wanted to talk about is sharing the skies with IFR and VFR traffic. Now, today the weather is nice here in Houston. And we did this check ride. It was an instrument check ride, and we did it in VFR conditions and under VFR flight rules. But we were kind of pretending that we were IFR. And a long time ago when I became a DPE, I always said that one check ride I would never do. I would never do an instrument check ride on a Saturday in good weather because it was tough because you try to go at maybe at an uncontrolled airport and try to do instrument procedures, and there's a lot of VFR traffic in the traffic pattern, and it makes you where you really can't do what you want to do as pretending that you're IFR. But I've since changed the tune, and I'll go ahead and do that. But today was kind of an example. So here we are. We're at a remote airport, an uncontrolled airport away from our Class D airport, and we're flying an instrument approach. And the applicant was, what I had to explain to the applicant was that, the person that's in the traffic pattern in their Aranca Champ may not know the intersections. So to tell them that we're out here at this intersection, which is on a 5-mile final, might mean absolutely nothing to them. The other issue that we have at this airport is there is a VOR, and the VOR is located about 5 miles away from the airport. So when you're giving your position, a lot of times people tend to say, well, we're 12 miles south. Well, 12 miles south of what? Are you 12 miles south of the VOR or 12 miles south of the airport? And if they're co-located, it's not that big a deal. But in this case, they're not. So you got to be very careful as to where you are. And what I try to teach my students when I'm instructing is when you're trying to talk to the VFR traffic, always reference the airport and say that. We're 8 miles southeast of the airport inbound. We're going to enter this downwind for this runway. Sometimes we get wrapped up in our own little world and we kind of think that everybody is watching out for us, and that's really not the case. So we got to be really careful with that. And so, again, here we are. We're in a VFR conditions. We're under VFR flight rules. We are doing instrument approaches, but we're dealing with other VFR traffic. You got to be just very careful as to what you're saying and what you're trying to communicate. The bottom line is effective communication, and we've said this many times on the show. Our number one goal is to not die, and hitting another airplane would not end well for any of us.
And as I'm looking at the map right now, you're talking about 12 miles south, and where does that really mean? The Soaring Club is also about 12 miles south.
Right.
And they're using a different frequency.
Right.
And Then you have the VOR, and they're actually almost directly in line with one another. You know, Soaring Club, VOR, and the Navasota Airport that we're talking about. You know, so now you've got gliders that aren't making any noise, and they're all flying about on a day like today, catching those nice hot thermals and doing their thing, right?
Right.
You could be within a couple miles of 3 or 4 aircraft real easily on a day like today.
Yeah, and another thing that I've been guilty of, if you're at an uncontrolled airport, let's say you're in the pattern at an uncontrolled airport doing touch and goes, and you're the only one there, you may get very complacent with your radio calls, and in fact you may stop making radio calls. Hey, there's nobody here, so what's the big deal, right? Well, suppose there's another airplane and they have they taxi out and they don't hear anybody, so they think, well, gee, I won't make radio calls, and now you got 2 people not making radio calls, and of course that might not be a good situation. So just be vigilant, and communicate to people. Let them know what you're doing. Let them know you're going to do a touch and go. You're going to do a full stop, a stop and go, or whatever the case may be. The more information you can give to the other traffic, it's just better.
Well, that does almost take us right into our next topic. What does the option mean? So when I'm in the pattern all alone, can I say I'm on final for 17? I'm taking the option.
Yeah, I've never really heard that at an uncontrolled airport.
What does it mean when the tower here at this airport gives us that? What are they?
Yeah, at a controlled airport, when you're cleared for the option, basically you can do anything you want, to an extent. So typically we think of it can mean a touch and go, it can mean a stop and go, it can mean a full stop, or it can mean a low approach. And here at this airport, it's a very active training airport. So more times than not, air traffic control does clear you for the option. Now, having said that, if you're just in the pattern, you tell them you want to come in for, a lot of people will use the phrase pattern work. Some people say touch and goes. It's all the same. I think it's all effective communication. But air traffic control, I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying this, but air traffic control in general expects you to do touch and goes. So if you know that this is going to be a full stop and they clear you for the option, are you cleared to make a full stop? You absolutely are. But can you just help out everybody by just letting them know, hey, this is going to be a full stop? The other thing is stop and goes. That's probably something that we see less of, but I like to do stop and goes on check rides, and for several reasons. But and I'll usually tell the applicant, I'll say, let's make this an expeditious stop and go. Let's not come to a stop and sit there for 30 seconds. Let's try to get going pretty quickly. Because air traffic control is spacing it, probably expecting a touch and go. So I try to let them know that this one will be a stop and go, or this one will be a full stop. The almost into the very next thing that we were going to talk about. What's a low approach, and is there really a definition? I read an article recently where someone was confused at night in an airport in a bunch of traffic, and they had intersecting runways. They knew there was a big to a GA aircraft jet, and he was going to cross that intersection or have to hold short of it. Being situationally aware was helpful for him, but he actually interpreted low approach as get on the ground, get low, and get on the runway as if to land, right? That's not what low approach means. Right.
What is the official definition of low approach?
Well, I think most of us, that have done instrument training are used to low approach. It's just an easier way of, or a more expeditious way of getting more approaches in a given amount of time, rather than actually landing the airplane. If you look in the AIM, it is defined a low approach, sometimes referred to as a low pass, is the go-around maneuver following an approach. Instead of landing or making a touch and go, a pilot may wish to go around in order to expedite a particular operation or a series of practice instrument approaches in an example of such an operation. So where I hear it a lot at this airport is we have 2 runways here. Well, 3 if you count the water, but we have 2 paved runways. One being longer and the other one being fairly short. Most of the flight schools here at this airport, I think, either prohibit or discourage student pilots from landing on the short runway. And so a lot of times air traffic control will have maybe a business jet coming into the longer runway, and they will clear this person in the traffic pattern to for an option on the short runway. And a lot of times the student will say, hey, I'm a student pilot, I'm unable to land on the short runway. And a lot of times air traffic control will say, okay, you're cleared for a low approach only on the short runway. And I always cringe when I hear that, because you can hear confusion in the voice of the student pilot. So for the flight instructors, I think it might be a good idea to show a student pilot a low approach. Hey, we can just fly down low along the runway and just not land. And basically that's, in this case here, that's what air traffic control is trying to get you to do.
Well, and I think that is a very useful tactic to teach people really what ground effect is and how ground effect affects the aerodynamics of the aircraft. We used to have an instructor here that was really a good instructor, and he said always before solos he would have students fly the entire length of the runway in ground effect to feel it and be able to understand how they could interact with the ground a little bit. And it really helped students that were struggling with the flare or the landing component of the part of flying. It would just always solved it for them, because it made it all kind of click and make sense that when we get into that cushion of air, so you can do a low approach like that as well.
Yeah.
I think what I thought was interesting in the definition was that you really shouldn't be making a bunch of climbs and turns in that low approach. And if you're 500 feet, stay at 500 feet, and then once you're clear the environment, then go ahead and climb out like you normally would on a takeoff, etc.
Right.
So hopefully that'll limit some low approach confusion. Another topic that we wanted to talk about that I thought was interesting, we stumbled across this wealth of resources that I didn't know existed, and we wanted to pass it along. The FAA FAST team, the safety team, has just released somewhere in the last couple of months something called 57 seconds to safer flying. And the videos are really well put together. They're all about 57 seconds. They have a little bit of a intro outro that makes them almost 2 minutes long, but the content in the series is really 57 seconds to safer flying, and a lot of it has to do with component failures. We talk about this all the time on the show about what am I going to do if I have a full electrical failure? What am I going to do if my fuel pump quits working? What am I going to do? Blah, blah, blah. Well, there's a whole bunch of videos that are 57 seconds long that the FAA has put out there. They also have flying and CBD in 57 seconds. So if you have questions of how CBD is interpreted or thought of by the FAA and what it might do to your body, you can take that out and check that out on there. Pattern precision in 57 seconds. I think I spent a lot of time in my training days looking for articles and documents on what is a perfect pattern. Well, there's a perfect pattern precision video out there to watch. A lot of people don't know what safety wire is, and aircraft have a lot of things that have been safety wired, and pretty much it's an attempt by mechanics and engineers to place a wire on something that shouldn't come undone. So it prevents a nut from backing off. There's safety wire on the oil filler tube that's tied to the engine, so it's actually screwed to the engine, and then it's got safety wire that if for whatever reason the screwing component came off or came undone, the safety wire would prevent it from actually just blowing off and letting all the oil leave the plane, which would be really, really bad. We've talked about wings proficiency, and that's really one of the mottos or goals of the FAST team. If you don't know what the wings program is and how it works, there's a 57-second video on how the wings program works, and on and on and on. I think it's a lot of good stuff out there. Wouldn't make good podcasts because they're only 57 seconds, but you could watch all these on YouTube probably in about an hour and learn a whole lot of stuff and get kind of that knowledge gem kind of reworking in your mind, and get fired up about some things that will make you a better pilot for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of them that I thought was interesting is really, what are you going to do? How are you going to handle a startled response, right? Like, I haven't had that big emergency happen for me yet, and hopefully I can continue to avoid it. But man, if that engine starts running really, really rough and it's unbalanced and I think it's falling apart, man, I'm going to have a panic attack. How do you deal with that? What's that going to be like? And again, there's another 57-second video out there for you to watch. So good resources on the FAA Fast Team YouTube page. Go check it out, and hopefully you guys can be safer pilots. Now, to that, we found that because we were talking about component failures again. We have this discussion regularly, but it's still something that I don't feel like people are proficient in. And the conversation started around a G1000 today in our lobby of the flight school, and we were just all shooting the breeze, talking about components in aircraft and what are we going to do if they fail and how do we know they fail, and troubleshooting. And in the G1000 in a Cessna 172, I was challenging some people in the front and asking them what would happen if this happened. What would happen if this happened? So Wally, we're going to role play a little bit and see if we can't educate some people out there listening to our show today. What would happen, Wally, if we were flying in a perfectly good aircraft, 8,000 feet, obviously on an instrument plan, flight plan between Houston and Dallas? We're exactly halfway between the two cities, and we'll create a long pause for the listener here. But what would happen in that moment, exactly halfway, if my standby battery failed in an aircraft with a G1000? What would I expect to have happen? We'll let all you listeners think about that question for a second and see if you can come up with the right answer. Wally, what do you think would happen?
Well, based on the fact that it's called a standby battery, I'm kind of thinking it's for standby. It's kind of my backup battery. And so I would say not much would happen, except maybe an indication. But as far as losing components or something failing that we I would say nothing.
Yep. Maybe in an actuator, and that's about it. Maybe
right.
the volts go to zero on the standby battery, but in all actuality, it wouldn't be the end of the road. And so the answers that I got were very interesting. They were, this could happen, all these things where I think people were trying to maybe impress me with their answer. I don't know. They wanted to make it a bigger deal than it might be, which was interesting. But we carried on the conversation and said, well, now it's nighttime. It's 8,000 feet. We're halfway between Houston and Dallas. What would we tell our friends to do, or our students to do, or our family members to do in that situation? Like, and we joke about this on the show, but what would be your resolution if it was you in a G1000 trainer aircraft, standby battery fails at night?
Well, I look at a standby battery a little bit like the spare tire in my car. Okay, it's the extra battery. I have a spare tire in my car. If the spare tire in my car becomes uninflated, which I'm wondering if my car has tire pressure indicators. I wondered if it even looks at the spare tire. I don't know.
I don't think it's hooked up to it. But
I don't think so. But anyway, if I'm flying along and if I lost a standby battery and I'm halfway, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep going too. So we continued and said, okay, we're up there and we're in IMC. Are we going to do anything different? that might be one where I'd start thinking, now I really don't want the other battery, did I?
Right.
But if I've had no indication, is it a reason to panic? Probably not.
No.
I've never had to use the standby battery in an aircraft ever anyway. So why, I think we all get nervous and we start thinking about worst case scenario stuff when these things happen. But if I've never used a standby battery, what's the reality of me needing to use it in this one flight in these current conditions?
Right.
Probably still pretty slim.
Right.
So then I challenged the group up front and said, hey, is the standby battery required equipment at night? We have all this tomato flames and we have this practicality stuff that we learn to pass check rides, but I think we would both, and I'd probably say myself included, don't read the POH close enough to know what all is really required, because we kind of go through that tomato flame stuff, and then it is, and whatever else the POH says is required, right? So is a standby battery in a G1000 single engine aircraft required equipment for night flight? And the answer is no. It's not required for night flight. It's not required for IMC flight in the United States. The Cessna POH that I have for one of my aircraft says it's required in Europe or whatever the civil air agency is over there, but for IFR. But I was pretty shocked that it wasn't required equipment for IFR flight in the United States. But that kind of tells you what the engineers think about the necessity of that standby battery for operating that aircraft.
Right.
Then this led to a whole nother conversation about electricity. I don't really know electricity really well, like in the wall. I'm not afraid to change a plug or something, but I don't really understand how it works. So it's always kind of been this little ghost to me. But I've learned enough concepts to understand what happens and what doesn't happen, specifically in aircraft, now that I've owned a flight school for 4 years plus. So I asked them, we kind of transitioned. I said, in that Cessna, what number would I expect to see below that main battery and that standby battery from a volts perspective? And there was a student up there in the front, and they said, well, I think it would say 24. And I said, it could say 24 very easily. Now we're in flight. We're moving along. Again, we'll go back to our Dallas trip. We're 8,000 feet halfway between, and the main battery says 24 volts. What would that tell me? There's some really good information in that. Why don't you talk me through a little bit, Wally, what information I should be able to glean from a Cessna G1000, Cessna 172 with G1000 that says 24 volts on that main battery? What should I be worried?
Yeah, it should not say 24 volts, because a 24 volt system, if your alternator is working properly, it should read about 28 volts. And think of it this way: if you're gonna, if you want to make you want to cook something, and you want to cook that thing, that whatever it is, that pie or whatever, and you want to get that thing to 400 degrees. Probably the most efficient way to get that thing to 400 degrees is to not set your oven to 400 degrees. Probably set your oven to 500 degrees or 480 or 450. Set a little bit higher. And think of it that way. The alternator to properly charge a battery is going to put out a little bit higher voltage than the battery. So in a 12 volt system, you would expect to see 14 volts. In a 24 volt system, or a 28 volt system. We use those
very
numbers.
Interchangeably.
They're interchangeably.
Yeah.
A 28 volt system and a 24 volt system, same thing for the most part. Okay, so we would expect to see 28 volts. So if you do have the ability to read voltage in your airplane, someday when you're out, just reach down and turn the alternator off, and you'll see that voltage readout go from either 28 to 24 or from 14 to 12.
How important is it in your mind to know the voltage of your aircraft?
It's extremely important, just from the standpoint of having to jump the airplane off. If you're stuck at an FBO somewhere and you run the battery down or whatever, you leave something on, you go have lunch, you come back, and you can't start the airplane, you go in the FBO and say, hey, I need to, can someone help me jump the airplane off?
Now I'm putting myself back in my early days of flying. If I heard someone tell me that they had to jump my aircraft, there ain't no freaking way I was going to fly that aircraft, right? So if we talk through electricity a little bit about this, what's really happening when you jump an aircraft?
Well, it's just like jumping a car. You're borrowing the power from another source to get the airplane going.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that the plane's broken. It means the battery's been drained. And I think, we don't put much fear and uncertainty and doubt around jumping a car because it's if it doesn't work, meaning the alternator doesn't keep the car running or the car battery charging, we're just going to stay in the parking lot we're in and no harm, no foul, right?
Right.
Same thing in a plane, though. Really, we're using the external source to provide enough power to turn the starter, which is really the primary reason to have a battery.
Right.
It's to turn the starter, which then turns the engine, which then turns the alternator and produces this, whether it be 14 or 28 volts of power output that then also charges the battery and runs all of the stuff in our cockpit.
Yeah.
It's a really smart thing to understand the volts. I challenge people often, how many volts does that aircraft have? And they look at me dumbfounded, like they shouldn't even have to know that information. But yeah, it's going to become important when you need to be jumped. The ramp guy's not going to configure it based on what he thinks. He's going to make you tell him what you know to be that voltage. Because if I try to jump a 14-volt system with a 28-volt jumper, that's going to create a spark. It's going to create some overages.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in college, a friend of mine got a job flying a corporate airplane, and it was a cabin class twin engine airplane that had a 28-volt system, and he was so excited about this job. One of the first things he did is went to the local discount store and bought a handheld vacuum cleaner and went out, and he was going to just vacuum this airplane and make it spick and span for the owner. He said he plugged it in, and this handheld vacuum cleaner, a cigarette lighter adapter worked for, he said it worked really fast and loud for about 15 seconds, and then it just went poof and quit working. So he took it back to the store, and they gave him a new one, and he came back and he plugged it in, and it did the same thing. And then a friend of his said, well, that airplane's got a 28-volt system, and that's a 12-volt vacuum cleaner. You just
Burnt up.
Fried two of them. So yeah, be careful about that. And it goes back to, so could you jump an airplane off using your car? And if you got a 12-volt airplane, absolutely.
Yep.
My Saratoga, I've got a Piper Saratoga. It's got a 12-volt system, and I within the last 6 months jumped it off using a truck.
I've seen people jump aircraft with golf carts. You just got to pair enough batteries together to get to that right voltage, and then be able to jump that airplane off. And I think I guess for the people that were in the front today, and we were talking through this, they were reflecting on, like, why don't people teach us this information? And my reflection was, I think we do teach it. I think we've all heard this information. It's not like it's brand new. We go through this phase, I think, in flight training. All of us have, I think, where we learn and memorize things that don't make a lot of sense. We memorize, and I cringe when I hear people are studying for a test when they're really using a test memorization tool, because they're not really studying for the test. They're memorizing some answers so they can pass the test. And I think that's what happens. We talk about this as a 14, on my instrument check ride with you probably asked me a little bit about the aircraft, and I probably went through and said, it's a 4-cylinder Lycoming engine. I have a 76-inch prop. I have a 24-volt system. And I rattled off whatever was on the first few pages of the POH, and you don't know if I really knew it or didn't know it. You could have inquired. But the fact of the matter is I already had all the right answers out of my mouth. Like, what more could you ask?
Right.
But did I really understand any of that stuff back then?
Yeah.
Probably not. I understand it a whole lot better today.
Yeah.
And I think the people up front today, understand it a lot better, because there's some practicality to what the alternator is doing versus the battery, and the things that you can scan for and watch for. I would panic if I was in a IMC condition, and I looked down at a voltmeter in an aircraft, and that voltmeter said 12 volts.
Yeah.
I would freak out. I would probably declare an emergency. I would tell ATC, look, I have an alternator failure. Everything looks like it's still working right now, but I know I have an alternator failure. I have to get out of this situation. I need to get to where I can see the ground and in a hurry, because I don't know if I've got 3 minutes or 30 minutes or what.
Right.
And it could be an indication that maybe the alternator's not putting out enough charge. You used the example of I don't remember what your example was, but mine's always a pool. And if I had a pool and a pool had a hole in it, the water's going to drain out of that pool, and I need a hose that's going to put more water in than's leaking out.
Right.
And that's the way an alternator works to charge a battery. And if the pool is losing more than the alternator or the water the hose can put in it, then I'm going to ultimately run out of the battery power, and it's going to stop working. Right. That made a lot of sense when I explained it to them up there, right? Yeah. I also did what you always said, and I said, look, I unplugged my iPhone from the wall. It's going to not have a little squiggly line up there, and the battery's going to start going away. And when I plug it back in, it's going to start going back up, and we're really just charging the battery. The functionality is still all exactly the same.
Right.
And we don't know if this is a 110-volt system or a 220-volt system, but no one's ever plugged an iPhone into a dryer circuit, right?
Right.
So, but there's some knowledge that we should have about electricity. There's some things that'll make us better informed and maybe save us a vacuum cleaner or two in our lifetime as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else is on your mind today, Wally? Anything else?
No.
I think we're going to come back real soon. Obviously, we're always here on Mondays, but we're going to finally get around to doing that Behind the Props episode. I want to talk about multi-engine training coming up, and really the things that people need to learn and know. And we'll do that show real soon. Until then, one more thing from Wally.
And we do have we're going to have a guest here on the next couple of episodes. We actually, I was on a check ride with an applicant, and we actually had we declared an emergency.
All right.
And I'll just leave it there. We were waiting to find out what the situation with the airplane is so that we could come full circle in the episode. But the applicant's going to be our guest, and we're going to talk about how he handled it. He did a really, really nice job.
You're a pro, but were you scared?
I was. Well, I won't say scared, but I know my heart rate went up. Yep. There was probably about 15 seconds where I truly believed we were going to land off airport.
Wow.
So
scary stuff, but that's going to be a great episode. I can't wait to speak to that gentleman and dive into all those details. Until we record that show and meet those people in that emergency, fly safely and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.